We've all felt the sting of being judged by our appearance, but imagine facing that judgment on what should be the most important day of your life. Clara May knew that feeling all too well as she stepped off the stagecoach in Cedar Ridge, Montana in the winter of 1887. She was Jeremiah Stone's mail-order bride, and she wasn't what the townspeople expected. The whispers started immediately. The snickers followed her down the muddy main street. Clara May had traveled 2,000 miles to escape a world that never accepted her, hoping to find peace in the frontier wilderness. What she found instead was more of the same cruel judgment. But sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it takes the innocent voice of a 6-year-old girl to show grown adults what real beauty looks like. But could one child's love truly change an entire town's heart? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Clara May Hartwell had sat in her cramped boarding house room in Philadelphia, holding a newspaper advertisement that would change her life forever. The ink was smudged from her tears, but she could still make out every word of Jeremiah Stone's simple, honest plea: widower with young daughter seeking wife for companionship and partnership in Montana territory. Must be kind, hard-working, and willing to embrace frontier life. Appearance matters less than character. She had read those words dozens of times, her heart catching on that final sentence. In a world that had judged her harshly since childhood, here was a man who claimed to value what lay beneath the surface. Clara May had always been a large woman, her frame generous in ways that society deemed unacceptable. At 28, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood, working as a seamstress in a cramped shop where the other girls whispered about her behind bolts of fabric. But loneliness had a way of making even the most frightening prospects seem appealing. Clara May had carefully penned her response, her hands trembling as she wrote about her love of cooking, her skill with needle and thread, and her deep desire for family. She had been honest about her appearance, describing herself as a woman of substantial build but gentle heart, hoping that Jeremiah Stone was a man of his word. His reply had come swiftly, written in careful script on rough paper. The letter now rested in her worn leather satchel, alongside her mother's Bible and the few photographs she owned. "Miss Hartwell," it read, "your letter reveals a good soul, which is worth more than gold in this harsh land. My Sarah needs a mother's love, and I need a partner who understands that life out here demands strength of spirit above all else. If you're willing to brave the journey, we'll be waiting at the Cedar Ridge station come December." That letter had given Clara May the courage to sell her few possessions, buy a train ticket, and embark on the longest journey of her life. Now, as the Montana wind cut through her woolen coat, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Cedar Ridge was smaller than she had imagined, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street. The general store dominated one end, its painted sign barely readable through years of harsh weather. A saloon occupied the other end, its batwing doors swinging in the wind. Between them stood the essentials of frontier life: a blacksmith shop, a small church with a crooked steeple, the doctor's office, and the boarding house where she would stay until the wedding. The townspeople who had gathered to watch the stagecoach arrival made no effort to hide their curiosity. Clara May could feel their eyes assessing her as she gathered her belongings. Their whispered conversations carried on the cold air. She caught fragments of their words. Bigger than expected, poor Jeremiah. What was he thinking? And felt her cheeks burn despite the frigid temperature. Martha Caldwell emerged from the general store, her sharp features set in a disapproving frown. As the unofficial social arbiter of Cedar Ridge, Martha's opinion carried weight, and it was clear she found Clara May wanting. "You must be the bride," she said, her tone suggesting she might be announcing a funeral. "I'm Martha Caldwell. My husband and I run the store." "Clara May Hartwell," she replied, extending her hand with a warmth that Martha didn't return. "I'm pleased to meet you, Mrs. Caldwell. I suppose you're wondering where Mr. Stone is," Martha continued, glancing around as if expecting Jeremiah to materialize from the frozen air. He's likely tending to his trap lines. Mountain men keep their own schedule, you understand. The implication was clear. Clara May was not important enough to warrant punctuality. She nodded graciously, though her heart sank. She had imagined this moment differently, perhaps with her intended waiting eagerly, maybe even with flowers. Instead, she stood alone among strangers whose faces ranged from curious to openly hostile. Dr. Henry Prescott approached with more kindness than the others had shown. A man in his 50s, with graying temples and gentle eyes, he tipped his hat respectfully. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Miss Hartwell. I'm Doc Henley. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. Thank you, Doctor. It was long, but I'm grateful to have arrived safely." Clara May's voice carried genuine warmth, and she noticed how the doctor's expression softened in response. "Jeremiah's a good man," Doc Henley said quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. "His first wife, God rest her soul, died in childbirth 3 years ago. He's been raising little Sarah on his own, doing the best he can. That child needs a mother's touch." The mention of Sarah sparked something protective in Clara May's chest. She had always loved children, had imagined herself surrounded by little ones in her daydreams. The thought of a motherless child tugged at her heartstrings in ways that even Jeremiah's letter hadn't managed. Reverend Thomas appeared beside the doctor, his collar stark white against his black coat. "Miss Hartwell, I presume? I'll be conducting your wedding ceremony tomorrow. I trust you've prepared yourself spiritually for the sacred commitment of marriage." "Yes, Reverend," Clara May replied, though she wondered if anyone could truly prepare for marrying a stranger in a town full of disapproving faces. "I've prayed for guidance and strength." Good, the Reverend nodded approvingly. "Marriage is a holy covenant, not to be entered into lightly. I hope you understand the gravity of your situation." Before Clara May could respond, a commotion at the far end of the street caught everyone's attention. A tall figure emerged from behind the blacksmith shop, and Clara May's breath caught in her throat. Jeremiah Stone was nothing like she had imagined. He stood well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders filling out a worn leather coat. His dark hair was longer than fashionable, and a beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes were what captured her attention. They were deep blue, the color of mountain lakes, and they held a gentleness that his rugged appearance might have otherwise concealed. Beside him walked a small figure bundled in furs and wool, only her bright eyes visible beneath a knitted cap. This had to be Sarah, and Clara May felt her heart skip as the child looked up at her with frank curiosity rather than the adult's calculated judgment. Jeremiah's stride was unhurried as he approached, and Clara May noticed how the crowd seemed to part naturally before him. There was an authority to his presence, a quiet strength that commanded respect. When he finally stood before her, he removed his hat, revealing more of his weathered but handsome face. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice deep and warm despite the formal address. "I apologize for my tardiness. I was securing the cabin for winter weather. Please call me Clara May," she replied, studying his face for any sign of disappointment at her appearance. What she saw instead was careful assessment, not of her physical attributes, but of something deeper. He seemed to be taking her measure as a person, not as a potential ornament. "This is my daughter, Sarah," Jeremiah said, placing his large hand protectively on the child's shoulder. "Sarah, this is Clara May. She's come a very long way to meet us." Sarah stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood, tilting her head to study Clara May's face. "Are you really going to be my mama?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and uncertainty that broke Clara May's heart. Kneeling down to meet Sarah at eye level, Clara May spoke gently. "I'd like that very much, sweetheart, but only if you'd like it too." Sarah considered this seriously, then nodded once, with the gravity of a judge rendering verdict. "I think that would be nice. I don't remember my real mama very well." The simple acceptance of a child stood in stark contrast to the continued whispers and stares of the adults around them. Clara May felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the unexpected gift of this little girl's openness. Jeremiah's expression warmed as he watched the interaction between his daughter and his bride-to-be. "We should get you settled at the boarding house," he said, reaching for Clara May's satchel. "Mrs. Patterson has prepared a room for you." As they walked toward the boarding house, Clara May could feel the weight of every gaze upon them. She heard Martha Caldwell's voice rise above the others. "Well, I suppose it takes all kinds, though I can't imagine what that poor child will think when she's older." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he didn't break stride. Clara May, however, felt each word like a physical blow. She had hoped that distance might diminish the cruelty she had known all her life. But it seemed that human nature was the same whether in Philadelphia or Montana. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house proprietor, greeted them with professional courtesy that barely masked her obvious curiosity. She was a woman in her 60s, her grey hair pulled back severely, her manner brisk but not unkind. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "your room is ready. Supper is served at 6 o'clock sharp. The wedding is planned for tomorrow afternoon, I understand." "Yes, ma'am," Clara May replied, grateful for the woman's straightforward manner after the day's subtle hostilities. As Jeremiah and Sarah prepared to leave, the little girl surprised everyone by reaching up to take Clara May's hand. "Will you tell me a story tomorrow?" she asked with the trust that only children possess. "I'd love to," Clara May promised, squeezing the small hand gently. "I know lots of stories about brave princesses and kind dragons." Sarah's eyes lit up with delight. "Kind dragons? I've never heard about kind dragons." "Well then," Clara May said with her first genuine smile since arriving in Cedar Ridge, "I have quite a lot to tell you." As father and daughter walked away, Clara May watched them go with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Tomorrow, she would marry a man she had known for all of 30 minutes, become mother to a child who seemed willing to accept her, and try to build a life in a community that had already found her lacking. But as she climbed the stairs to her small room, Clara May carried with her the memory of Sarah's trusting hand in hers, and Jeremiah's respectful nod of farewell. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had found the family she had always dreamed of. Even if the rest of Cedar Ridge remained unconvinced, the leather satchel in her hands felt heavier now, weighted not just with her few possessions, but with the hopes and fears of a woman about to begin the most uncertain chapter of her life. Tomorrow would bring her wedding day, and with it, the chance to discover whether Jeremiah Stone was truly a man who valued character over appearance, and whether love could indeed bloom in the harsh soil of the Montana frontier. The morning of Clara May's wedding dawned grey and bitter cold, with snow beginning to fall in lazy flakes that promised a harsh day ahead. She stood before the cracked mirror in her boarding house room, adjusting the collar of her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had sewn herself, practical rather than beautiful, warm rather than fashionable. Her hands trembled as she pinned her brown hair into a simple bun, leaving a few soft tendrils to frame her round face. Mrs. Patterson had knocked earlier with a cup of weak coffee and a biscuit, offering what passed for breakfast. "The Reverend expects you at the church by 2 o'clock, she had said, her tone neutral, but her eyes holding a mixture of pity and curiosity. "Mr. Stone will meet you there." Now, as Clara May gathered her few belongings to move to Jeremiah's cabin after the ceremony, she paused over the small wooden doll that lay on her dresser. She had bought it in Philadelphia as a wedding gift for Sarah, carved from smooth pine with a painted face and dressed in scraps of calico. The doll represented her hopes of becoming not just a wife, but a mother to the little girl who had shown her such unexpected kindness. The walk to the church felt like the longest of Clara May's life. Word of the wedding had spread through Cedar Ridge, and it seemed half the town had found reasons to be on the main street at 2 o'clock. Conversations stopped as she passed, replaced by the kind of whispered commentary that followed her like shadows. "Look at the size of her," she heard Martha Caldwell say to her neighbor. "Poor man doesn't know what he's gotten himself into." "That dress does nothing for her figure," came another voice. "You'd think she'd at least try to make herself presentable." Clara May kept her eyes forward and her chin up, clutching the wooden doll against her chest like a talisman. Each comment felt like a small knife, but she had endured worse in Philadelphia. At least here, at the end of this walk, waited a man who had promised to value her character above all else. The church was small and simple, its wooden pews worn smooth by years of frontier congregations. Reverend Thomas stood at the altar in his black robes, his expression appropriately solemn for the occasion. But it was the sight of Jeremiah that made Clara May's breath catch in her throat. He had cleaned up for the wedding, his hair neatly combed and his beard trimmed. He wore a dark suit that had seen better days, but was clean and pressed. And in his hands he held a small bouquet of winter pine boughs tied with a red ribbon, the closest thing to flowers that the Montana winter could provide. Beside him stood Sarah, dressed in what was clearly her best dress, a brown wool with white lace collar that had been carefully mended in several places. The child's eyes were bright with excitement, and when she saw Clara May, she smiled and waved as if greeting a dear friend rather than witnessing her father's wedding to a stranger. But it was the congregation that made Clara May's heart sink. The pews were fuller than she had expected, filled with faces that ranged from merely curious to openly disapproving. She recognized Martha Caldwell in the front row, her lips pursed in perpetual disapproval. Behind her sat the other merchants and their wives, the blacksmith, several cowboys from nearby ranches, and what appeared to be half the eligible bachelors in the territory, all gathered to witness what they clearly expected to be a spectacle. As Clara May made her way down the short aisle, the whispers followed her like autumn leaves in the wind. She heard fragments. "Can't believe he's going through with it, that poor child. What a shame for a good man like Jeremiah," and felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. But then Jeremiah stepped forward to meet her halfway down the aisle, extending his arm in a gesture of support and partnership that spoke louder than any words could have. His blue eyes met hers with steady kindness, and she saw no regret there, no second thoughts about his decision. "You look very nice," he said quietly, his voice meant for her ears alone. "Blue is a good color for you." The simple compliment, perhaps the first genuine one she had received about her appearance in years, brought tears to Clara May's eyes. She took his offered arm, and together they walked to the altar while Sarah skipped alongside them, apparently oblivious to the tension radiating from the congregation. Reverend Thomas opened his Bible and began the familiar words of the marriage ceremony. His voice carried clearly through the small church as he spoke of the sacred bonds of matrimony, of love and honor, and cherishing one another through all of life's trials. Clara May tried to focus on the words, on the significance of the moment, but the whispers and poorly concealed snickers from the congregation made concentration difficult. When the Reverend asked if anyone had just cause why these two should not be wed, Martha Caldwell actually cleared her throat as if preparing to speak. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Sarah's innocent voice asking loudly, "What does that mean, Papa?" Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady as he whispered, "Nothing important, sweetheart," the ceremony continued. And when the time came for vows, Clara May was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice as she promised to love, honor and cherish this man she barely knew. Jeremiah's vows were simple and direct, spoken with the same quiet strength she had noticed the day before. "Do you, Jeremiah Stone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Thomas intoned. "I do," Jeremiah replied firmly, his eyes never leaving Clara May's face. "Do you, Clara May Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she whispered, her voice carrying more conviction than she had expected to feel. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." The kiss was gentle and brief, more ceremonial than passionate, but it carried a promise of respect and partnership that Clara May had never dared to hope for. As their lips met, Sarah clapped her hands with delight, her joy cutting through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. But the moment of happiness was short-lived. As the new couple turned to face the congregation, the reaction was immediate and crushing. Instead of the traditional well wishes and congratulations, they were met with a wall of barely concealed amusement and open mockery. "Well, that's done then," Martha Caldwell announced loudly. "I suppose we should wish them luck. They're certainly going to need it." Laughter rippled through the congregation, cruel and cutting. Clara May felt her face burn with shame, and she instinctively stepped closer to Jeremiah, seeking shelter in his solid presence. It was then that Sarah, with the fearless honesty of childhood, stepped forward and did something that would echo through Cedar Ridge for years to come. Looking up at Clara May with eyes full of affection and acceptance, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the wooden doll. "This is for you," Sarah said, pressing the doll into Clara May's hands. "Papa carved her for me when Mama died, but I want you to have her now. She's been waiting for someone special to love her." The gesture was so unexpected, so purely given, that Clara May nearly dropped the simple toy. But it was Sarah's next words that truly silenced the congregation. Looking around at the assembled adults with the moral clarity that only children possess, Sarah announced in her clear, carrying voice, "I don't understand why everyone is being mean to my new mama. She's pretty to me, and she promised to tell me stories about kind dragons. That's more important than what anybody looks like." The church fell utterly silent. Martha Caldwell's mouth hung open, the laughter died on the lips of the Cowboys, and even Reverend Thomas looked taken aback by the child's simple wisdom. Clara May knelt down to Sarah's level, her heart so full of love for this brave little girl that she could barely speak. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered, holding the wooden doll close to her heart. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone has ever given me." Jeremiah's hand settled protectively on Clara May's shoulder, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warning that every person in that church understood. "My daughter has just shown more Christian charity and good sense than most of the adults in this room. I'd suggest you all think about that on your way home." The congregation began to file out, their earlier amusement replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Some looked ashamed, others defiant, but none dared to meet Jeremiah's steady gaze as they passed. As the church emptied, Clara May remained kneeling beside Sarah, holding the wooden doll that had become so much more than a simple toy. It was a bridge between them, a symbol of acceptance and love that transcended the cruel judgments of the adult world. "Are you ready to come home?" Jeremiah asked gently, offering his hand to help Clara May to her feet. Home. The word carried a weight of promise that Clara May had never dared to believe might be hers. She stood, took her husband's hand, and with Sarah skipping between them, walked out of the church and into the beginning of her new life. The snow was falling harder now, covering the muddy streets of Cedar Ridge with a blanket of pristine white. But Clara May barely noticed the cold. Wrapped in the warmth of an unexpected family's acceptance, she felt truly warm for the first time in years. The cabin, that would now be Clara May's home, sat nestled against a pine-covered hillside, 3 miles outside of Cedar Ridge. It was larger than she had expected, built with the sturdy craftsmanship of a man who understood the demands of Montana winters. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and the windows glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, making it look like something from a fairy tale rather than the harsh reality of frontier life. Jeremiah carried Clara May's few belongings inside, while Sarah chatted excitedly about showing her new mother around. The interior was sparse but functional, built around a large central room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by comfortable chairs that showed the wear of long winter evenings. The furniture was handmade but well crafted, speaking to Jeremiah's skill with tools as well as traps. "This is where Papa and I eat," Sarah announced, pointing to a rough-hewn table surrounded by 3 mismatched chairs. "Papa made the 3rd chair special for you. He said a family needs to sit together for meals." Clara May's throat tightened with emotion at this simple evidence of Jeremiah's thoughtfulness. He had prepared for her arrival in ways both practical and meaningful, making space for her not just in his home, but in his life. The kitchen area was well equipped by frontier standards, with a cast-iron stove, a dry sink, and shelves lined with preserved goods and basic supplies. But it was what she didn't see that told Clara May the most about this household. There were no feminine touches, no curtains at the windows, no decorative elements that spoke of a woman's presence. This had been a house of widower and daughter, functional but lacking the warmth that only a woman's care could provide. "Would you like to see your recipe book collection?" Jeremiah asked, gesturing toward a wooden crate beside the stove. "Sarah and I aren't much for fancy cooking. We've been getting by on basic fare." Clara May approached the crate with curiosity, lifting the lid to reveal a collection of well-worn recipe books and handwritten cards. Her heart skipped when she recognized her grandmother's familiar script on several of the cards, recipes she had carefully copied and included in her letter to Jeremiah. Hoping to demonstrate her domestic skills, "You kept my recipes," she said softly, lifting one of the cards. It was her grandmother's recipe for apple butter, written in fading ink, with notes about the proper consistency and timing. "I figured they were important to you," Jeremiah replied. "Sarah's been looking forward to trying that molasses cake you mentioned." Sarah bounced on her toes with excitement. "Can we make it tonight, please?" Clara May looked around the kitchen, taking inventory of the available ingredients. It had been a long day, and she was exhausted from the emotional strain of the wedding and the journey to the cabin. But the hope in Sarah's eyes was impossible to resist. "I think we might be able to manage something special," she said, pulling her grandmother's recipe from the collection. "But you'll have to be my assistant cook. Can you handle that responsibility?" "Oh, yes." Sarah clapped her hands together. "I'm a very good helper. Papa taught me how to measure flour and everything." As Clara May began to gather ingredients, she felt some of the tension of the day beginning to ease. This was familiar territory. The rhythm of cooking, the precision of measuring and mixing, the alchemy that transformed simple ingredients into something that could bring comfort and joy. In the kitchen, she had always felt competent and valued, even when the rest of the world found her wanting. "Sarah, can you help me find the molasses?" she asked, tying one of Jeremiah's work aprons around her waist. The fabric smelled of pine smoke and leather, masculine scents that reminded her she was now part of a different life entirely. "It's up there." Sarah pointed to a high shelf. "Papa always has to get it down for me." Jeremiah appeared beside them, easily reaching the jar of dark molasses. "Anything else you need from up there?" Working together, they assembled the ingredients while Sarah chattered about her daily routines, her favorite games, and her memories of helping her father with various household tasks. Clara May listened with growing affection, marveling at the child's resilience and good cheer despite losing her mother at such a young age. "Papa tried to make a cake once," Sarah confided, as Clara May began creaming butter and sugar. "But it came out flat as a pancake. We fed it to the chickens, and even they weren't too excited about it." Jeremiah's cheeks reddened slightly. "I'm better with traps than with baking," he admitted. Sarah's being kind about how terrible it was. "Cooking is just practice," Clara May said diplomatically. "Some people have a natural feel for it. Others need to learn through trial and error. There's no shame in either approach." As she worked, Clara May found herself falling into an easy rhythm with her new family. Sarah proved to be an excellent helper, carefully measuring ingredients and following instructions with the serious concentration of a child trying to do her very best. Jeremiah contributed by keeping the fire at the proper temperature and providing ingredients from high shelves. But mostly he sat at the table watching his wife and daughter work together with an expression of quiet contentment. The cake went into the oven just as full darkness settled over the mountains. Clara May used the waiting time to prepare a simple supper of salt pork, beans, and cornbread, humble fare but filling and warm. As they ate by the light of kerosene lamps, she began to feel the first stirrings of something that might eventually become the sense of belonging she had always craved. "Tell us about your family back east," Jeremiah said as they finished their meal. "Do you have brothers and sisters?" Clara May's smile faltered slightly. "I was an only child," she said carefully. My parents died when I was 16, and I've been on my own since then. My grandmother raised me after my mother passed, but she's been gone for 5 years now. The loneliness of her previous life hung heavy in her words, and she saw understanding pass between father and daughter. They too knew what it meant to lose the people who mattered most. Well, you're not on your own anymore, Sarah declared, with the certainty of childhood. Now you have us and we have you. That makes us all less lonely. From the mouths of babes, Clara May thought, reaching over to smooth Sarah's dark hair. That's exactly right, sweetheart. We have each other now. The kitchen began to fill with the rich, spicy scent of baking cake, and Sarah bounced in her chair with anticipation. It smells like Christmas, she said dreamily. Speaking of Christmas, Jeremiah said, it's only 3 weeks away. We usually just exchange small gifts, nothing fancy. I hope that's all right with you. Clara May nodded, though her heart sank slightly. She had no money for gifts and no idea what would be appropriate for her new family. Back in Philadelphia, Christmas had been a solitary affair, marked only by attending church service and perhaps splurging on a small piece of candy. Sarah seemed to sense her uncertainty. I'm making something special for you, she announced proudly. Papa's helping me, but it's a secret. When the cake finished baking, Clara May pulled it from the oven with a sense of triumph. It had risen properly, the top golden brown and springy to the touch. The kitchen filled with the rich aroma of molasses, cinnamon, and nutmeg, the essence of comfort and home. Can we have some now? Sarah asked hopefully. It needs to cool first, Clara May explained, setting the pan on the windowsill. But while we're waiting, maybe you'd like to hear that story about the kind dragon I promised you. Sarah's eyes lit up with delight, and even Jeremiah seemed interested as they settled around the fireplace. Clara May began to weave a tale about a dragon who was feared by everyone in the kingdom, not because he was mean, but because he looked different from other dragons. His scales were silver instead of green, and he was smaller than his brothers, so everyone assumed he must be dangerous. But one day, Clara May continued, Sarah curled up beside her on the sofa, a little princess got lost in the forest. She was scared and cold, and when the silver dragon found her, everyone expected him to be mean to her. Instead, he used his gentle flame to warm her up and guided her safely home. The princess saw that what made him different also made him special. His silver scales reflected moonlight so he could travel safely at night, and his smaller size meant he could fly quietly without frightening anyone. What happened then? Sarah asked breathlessly. The kingdom learned that being different isn't something to fear, Clara May said softly. Sometimes the most beautiful hearts come in unexpected packages. The princess and the dragon became the best of friends, and everyone realized they had been wrong to judge him by his appearance. Sarah was quiet for a moment, digesting the story's message. Then she looked up at Clara May with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. Like how the people in town were wrong about you? The innocent observation hit Clara May like a physical blow, and she had to blink back tears. Something like that, she managed to say. Jeremiah's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke. Sarah's right. The people in town don't know what they're talking about. They're going to learn better given time. Can we have cake now? Sarah asked, apparently satisfied with the adults' responses to her story analysis. The molasses cake was everything Clara May had hoped it would be. Moist, spicy, and redolent, with memories of her grandmother's kitchen. Sarah declared it the best thing she had ever tasted, and even Jeremiah's stoic composure cracked into a genuine smile of appreciation. As they cleaned up the dishes together, Clara May felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. For the first time in her adult life, she was part of a family, contributing to something larger than her solitary existence. The wooden doll sat on the mantelpiece, a reminder of the unexpected acceptance she had found in this remote corner of Montana. Later, as Jeremiah showed her to the small bedroom that would be hers, he had tactfully prepared separate sleeping arrangements until they were more comfortable with each other. Clara May reflected on the day's events. The wedding had been painful, but it had also revealed the true character of both her new husband and her stepdaughter. They had stood by her when others showed cruelty, and they had welcomed her into their lives with open hearts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew. There would be more encounters with the judgmental townspeople, more opportunities for hurt and disappointment. But tonight, as she listened to Sarah's sleepy chatter from the next room and Jeremiah's quiet movements as he banked the fire, Clara May felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. 2 weeks into her marriage, Clara May woke to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, bent over a piece of paper with intense concentration. The little girl's tongue poked out slightly as she worked, a habit Clara May had already learned to associate with Sarah's most serious endeavors. "Good morning, sweetheart," Clara May said softly, not wanting to startle the child from her focused work. "What are you drawing there?" Sarah looked up with bright eyes and a smile that never failed to warm Clara May's heart. "It's a picture of our family," she announced proudly, turning the paper so Clara May could see. "See, there's Papa and there's me and there's you." Clara May's breath caught in her throat as she studied the drawing. Sarah had drawn 3 figures standing in front of a house, their stick-figure simplicity somehow managing to convey genuine affection. But it was how Sarah had depicted Clara May that brought tears to her eyes, not as the oversized, ungainly figure that mirrors and cruel comments had taught her to see, but as a smiling woman with kind eyes and arms outstretched as if offering a hug. "Sarah, this is beautiful," Clara May whispered, kneeling beside the child's chair. "May I hang it up somewhere special?" "Really, you want to keep it?" Sarah's face glowed with pleasure. "I want to treasure it forever," Clara May said, and meant every word. In all her 28 years, no one had ever created something just for her, had never thought her worthy of artistic immortalization. However simple, Jeremiah emerged from the bedroom, already dressed for his morning trap run. He paused when he saw Clara May and Sarah bent over the drawing, and Clara May caught a fleeting expression of something that might have been wonder crossing his weathered features. "Sarah's quite the artist," he said, moving to the stove to pour himself coffee from the pot Clara May had prepared earlier. "She gets that from her mother. Mary was always sketching flowers and birds when we first came out here. It was one of the few times Jeremiah had mentioned his first wife without prompting, and Clara May felt honored to be trusted with even this small glimpse into his past. She was learning that Jeremiah was a man who shared his thoughts carefully, doling out pieces of himself like precious rations that had to last through a long winter. "I think we should frame this properly," Clara May said, smoothing the paper carefully. "A family portrait deserves a place of honor." Sarah beamed at the idea, but her expression quickly grew serious. "Clara May, can you teach me to write my letters? Papa knows some, but he says you probably know more on account of you lived in the city." "I'd love to teach you," Clara May replied, already mentally planning lessons. "We could start with your name, and then maybe some simple words." Jeremiah paused in his morning preparations. "Are you sure you want to take that on? She can be pretty persistent when she gets an idea in her head." "I love persistent students," Clara May said with a smile. "They're the ones who really learn." After Jeremiah left for his trap lines, Clara May and Sarah settled at the kitchen table with paper and pencil. Sarah's eagerness to learn was infectious, and Clara May found herself enjoying the role of teacher more than she had expected. They worked through the alphabet, with Sarah carefully copying each letter and Clara May patiently correcting her grip on the pencil. "This is harder than drawing," Sarah observed after struggling with a particularly stubborn R. "Most worthwhile things are hard at first," Clara May said gently. "But every time you practice, it gets a little easier. Soon you'll be writing whole stories. Stories like the one about the kind dragon, if you want to. Or stories about brave little girls who live in the mountains. Or wise fathers who take care of their families. Or anything else your imagination can dream up." The morning flew by as they worked together, Sarah's natural intelligence making her a quick learner despite her young age. By the time they broke for lunch, she had successfully written her own name 3 times and was working on simple words like cat and dog. After lunch, The necessity of daily chores called them away from their impromptu school. Clara May had discovered that running a frontier household required skills she had never needed in her Philadelphia boarding house. There were chickens to feed, eggs to gather, bread to bake, and a dozen other tasks that kept a family fed and warm through the harsh Montana winter. But it was when they needed supplies from town that Clara May faced her first real test of courage since the wedding. They had run low on several essentials: flour, coffee, kerosene for the lamps, and Jeremiah suggested that Clara May and Sarah make the trip together while he finished working a particularly promising trapline. "Are you sure you'll be all right?" he asked, concern evident in his blue eyes. "I know the folks in town haven't exactly been welcoming." Clara May straightened her shoulders with determination she didn't entirely feel. "Sarah and I will be fine," she said. "It's time I faced them as your wife, not as some curiosity to be gawked at." The ride to town in Jeremiah's sturdy wagon gave Clara May time to prepare herself mentally for what was sure to be an ordeal. Sarah chattered happily beside her, pointing out landmarks and telling stories about various adventures she had shared with her father. Her innocent enthusiasm provided a welcome distraction from Clara May's growing nervousness. Cedar Ridge looked the same as it had 2 weeks earlier, but Clara May's perspective had changed. She was no longer a frightened stranger hoping for acceptance. She was Jeremiah Stone's wife and Sarah Stone's stepmother. A woman with a place and purpose in this community, whether they liked it or not. The general store was busier than she had expected, with several customers browsing the shelves, and Martha Caldwell holding court behind the counter. Conversations stopped as Clara May and Sarah entered, replaced by the familiar whispers and poorly concealed stares. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell," Clara May said politely, producing her shopping list. "I'll need these items if you have them in stock." Martha examined the list with the same expression she might use to inspect week-old fish. "Quite an ambitious list," she said with false sweetness. "I hope Jeremiah's trapping has been profitable enough to cover all this." The implication was clear. Martha doubted that Clara May understood the financial realities of frontier life, or perhaps suspected her of being extravagant with her husband's hard-earned money. Clara May felt her cheeks burn, but kept her voice level. "My husband and I discuss all household expenses," she replied calmly. "I'm sure we can manage these few necessities." Sarah had wandered over to examine a display of penny candy, and Clara May watched with growing alarm as several older children approached her, with expressions that reminded Clara May uncomfortably of their parents' cruel amusement. "Hey, Sarah," one of the boys called out. How do you like your new fat mama?" Sarah turned to face the boy with the fearless directness that Clara May had come to love and admire. "She's not fat," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "She's just bigger than some people, and that means she gives better hugs. Plus she makes the best molasses cake in the whole territory. My ma says she's so big, she probably breaks chairs," another child chimed in, clearly repeating overheard adult conversation. "Well, your ma is wrong," Sarah replied with the devastating honesty of childhood. "And it's not nice to say mean things about people. Clara May is kind and smart, and she's teaching me to write stories. What can your ma do besides gossip with the other ladies?" The adult customers in the store shifted uncomfortably at Sarah's pointed observation. Clara May felt simultaneously proud of her stepdaughter's loyalty and mortified at being the center of yet another public spectacle. "Sarah," she called softly, "come help me carry some of these packages." But Sarah wasn't finished defending her new mother. She marched up to the boy who had started the cruel comments and stood as tall as her 6-year-old frame would allow. "If you say mean things about my mama again, I'll tell my papa," she declared. "And he doesn't like it when people are mean to our family." The mention of Jeremiah Stone's potential displeasure was enough to silence the children, and they quickly found other areas of the store to occupy themselves. But Clara May noticed that several of the adult customers were watching Sarah with something that might have been grudging respect, and Martha Caldwell's expression had shifted from amusement to something approaching discomfort. As they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Clara May felt a mixture of pride and concern about Sarah's passionate defense. The child's loyalty was touching, but Clara May worried about the consequences of Sarah positioning herself as her stepmother's champion against the entire town. "Sarah," she said gently as they started home, "I appreciate you standing up for me back there, but you don't have to fight my battles for me." "But they were being mean to you," Sarah protested. "Papa says family takes care of family." "Your papa is right about that," Clara May agreed. "But sometimes the best way to take care of someone is to show them love and kindness, not to argue with people who don't understand yet." "Don't understand what?" Clara May thought carefully about her answer, wanting to be honest without burdening the child with adult complexities. "Don't understand that what makes people special isn't how they look on the outside, but what they're like on the inside. Some people need more time to learn that lesson." Sarah considered this seriously. "Like in your dragon story?" "Exactly like in my dragon story." That evening, as they shared another of Clara May's hearty dinners, this time a stew rich with vegetables from the root cellar and tender chunks of venison from Jeremiah's hunting, Clara May recounted the day's events. She was careful to emphasize Sarah's courage and loyalty while downplaying the cruelty of the other children's comments. Jeremiah's expression darkened as he listened. "I'm sorry you had to face that," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry Sarah was exposed to it." "Sarah handled herself beautifully," Clara May replied. "She's got more courage and wisdom than most of the adults in that store." "Still," Jeremiah said, his jaw tightening, "a child shouldn't have to defend her own family against grown people who ought to know better." "Give them time," Clara May said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "People are slow to change their minds, but they can change them." Later that evening, as Clara May helped Sarah prepare for bed, the little girl surprised her with a question that showed how much she had absorbed from the day's events. "Clara May, were you sad when those kids said mean things about you?" Clara May sat on the edge of Sarah's narrow bed, choosing her words carefully. "I was sad that they thought it was all right to be cruel," she said honestly. "But I wasn't sad about who I am. I like who I am, even if some other people don't understand me yet." "I like who you are too," Sarah said sleepily, curling up under her quilt. "You're the best mama I could have asked for." As Clara May blew out the lamp and tiptoed from Sarah's room, she carried those words with her like a precious gift. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. More encounters with people who judged her harshly, more opportunities for hurt and disappointment. But tonight, she had the love of a brave little girl who saw beauty where others saw only flaws, and the respect of a good man who valued character over appearance. The drawing Sarah had made that morning was now hanging on the wall beside the fireplace, held in place with small wooden clips that Jeremiah had carved that afternoon. Every time Clara May looked at it, she was reminded that love, once given freely, had the power to transform not just how others saw you, but how you saw yourself. The deep Montana winter settled over Cedar Ridge like a heavy quilt, bringing with it an isolation that Clara May had not anticipated. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and the wind howled through the pine trees with a voice that sounded lonely even to someone accustomed to solitude. But inside their warm home, Clara May discovered that isolation could also bring unexpected intimacy. With Jeremiah's traplines covered in snow and outdoor work limited to essential chores, the three of them spent long evenings gathered around the fireplace. It was during these quiet hours that Clara May began to piece together the quilt that would become one of her most treasured possessions and a symbol of her growing place in this small family. The idea had come to her gradually. Sarah was growing so quickly that many of her dresses from the previous year no longer fit properly. Rather than simply put them away or use them for rags, Clara May saw an opportunity to create something beautiful and lasting. She began cutting the outgrown garments into careful squares, each piece holding memories of Sarah's adventures and milestones. "What are you doing with my old blue dress?" Sarah asked one evening, watching Clara May work by lamplight. "I'm going to make something special from all your outgrown clothes," Clara May explained, holding up a square of faded calico. This way, even though you can't wear them anymore, they'll still be part of our family. Sarah's eyes grew wide with understanding. Like a memory blanket? Exactly like a memory blanket. Clara May smiled at the child's perfect description. Each piece will tell a story about something important that happened while you were wearing it. Jeremiah looked up from the trap he was mending, his weathered hands pausing in their work. That's a fine idea, he said quietly. Mary always said that the best quilts were the ones that held stories. It was another rare mention of his first wife, and Clara May felt honored to be following in a tradition that Mary had valued. She was learning to treasure these small glimpses into Jeremiah's past, understanding that each shared memory was a gift of trust. Can you tell me a story about each piece? Sarah asked, snuggling closer to Clara May on the sofa. Of course. Clara May held up a square of yellow cotton. This is from the dress you were wearing the day I arrived in Cedar Ridge. Do you remember? You were bundled up in your winter coat, but I could see this yellow peeking out at the collar. I remember, Sarah said softly. I was nervous about meeting you. And what about now? Now I'm not nervous at all. Now you're just my mama. The casual way Sarah said those words, my mama, never failed to make Clara May's heart swell with joy and gratitude. She was no longer just Jeremiah's mail-order bride or the woman who cooked their meals and mended their clothes. She was Sarah's mama, a title she had earned through patience, kindness, and love. As the weeks passed and the quilt grew under Clara May's careful stitches, it became a focal point for their evening conversations. Sarah would curl up beside her stepmother, watching the needle flash in and out of the fabric, while Clara May told stories or helped her practice her letters. Jeremiah would work on his winter projects, mending equipment, carving new handles for tools, crafting small toys for Sarah, but Clara May noticed that he often glanced up to watch them work together with an expression of quiet contentment. You're bringing something to this house that's been missing, he said one evening after Sarah had gone to bed. Not just the cooking and the housekeeping, though those are appreciated. Something warmer than that. What do you mean? Clara May asked, though she thought she might know. Hope, I suppose. And purpose beyond just survival. Mary used to say that a house becomes a home when there's someone in it who thinks about tomorrow as well as today. He gestured toward the growing quilt in her lap. You're thinking about tomorrow. Clara May felt tears prick her eyes at his words. In Philadelphia, she had lived from day to day, working to survive with little thought of a future that seemed to offer nothing but more of the same loneliness and judgment. Here, for the first time in her adult life, she was planning for a future, creating something that would last, building traditions that Sarah might someday pass on to her own children. I want to belong here, she said simply. I want to be worthy of the place you and Sarah have given me in your lives. You already are worthy. Jeremiah replied with the quiet certainty that she was learning to associate with his most important pronouncements. The question was never whether you were worthy. The question was whether we were worthy of you. The conversation was interrupted by a soft whimper from Sarah's room. Both adults rose immediately, Clara May's motherly instincts now as sharp as Jeremiah's paternal ones. They found Sarah tossing restlessly in her narrow bed, her face flushed with fever. She's burning up, Clara May said, pressing her palm to the child's forehead. Her experience caring for sick boarders in Philadelphia had taught her to recognize the signs of serious illness, and what she felt sent a chill of fear through her heart. I'll ride for Doc Henley, Jeremiah said, already reaching for his coat. In this weather, the roads are barely passable. Clara May was already moving toward the kitchen, her mind cataloguing the supplies they had on hand. Besides, I've nursed plenty of fevers. Let's see what we can do ourselves first. What followed were 3 of the longest days of Clara May's life. Sarah's fever spiked dangerously high, and she alternated between burning heat and violent chills that no amount of blankets seemed to ease. Clara May barely left the child's bedside, cooling her with damp cloths when the fever peaked, wrapping her in quilts when the chills took hold, and coaxing spoonfuls of broth between her cracked lips when she was lucid enough to swallow. Jeremiah paced the cabin like a caged wolf. his helplessness in the face of his daughter's illness almost painful to watch. This was not a problem he could solve with strength or skill or determination. This required patience and nursing knowledge that he simply didn't possess. "Let me help," he said repeatedly. But there was little he could do beyond keeping the fire burning and preparing the endless cups of tea and bowls of broth that Clara May requested. On the second night, when Sarah's fever reached its most dangerous point, Clara May made a decision that revealed just how completely she had embraced her role as this child's mother. She climbed into the narrow bed beside Sarah, wrapping the sick girl in her arms and using her own body heat to regulate Sarah's temperature. "What are you doing?" Jeremiah asked, his voice rough with worry and exhaustion. "Sometimes human contact can help break a fever," Clara May explained, smoothing Sarah's sweat-dampened hair. "My grandmother taught me that when I was young. The body seems to remember how to find its proper temperature when it's close to another person." Jeremiah watched them with an expression Clara May couldn't quite read. "You could get sick yourself," he pointed out. "Then I'll get sick," Clara May replied simply. "But I won't let her fight this alone." Throughout that long night, Clara May held Sarah close, monitoring every breath, every change in temperature, every flutter of her eyelids. She dozed fitfully, but woke instantly whenever Sarah stirred or seemed distressed. Jeremiah kept vigil from the bedside chair, ready to help with whatever was needed. Just before dawn, Sarah's fever finally broke. She opened her eyes and looked up at Clara May with recognition and a weak smile. "Mama," she whispered, the word barely audible, but carrying the weight of absolute trust and love. "I'm right here." "Sweetheart," Clara May whispered back, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not going anywhere." Later, after Sarah had fallen into her first peaceful sleep in days and color had begun to return to her pale cheeks, Jeremiah found Clara May sitting by the kitchen window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with exhausted but peaceful eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. But the words carried a depth of gratitude that made them feel inadequate. "She's my daughter too," Clara May replied, and realized as she said it that it was completely true. Somewhere during those 3 desperate days and nights, the bonds of legal marriage and social convenience had transformed into something deeper and more permanent. Sarah wasn't just the child she cared for. She was the daughter of her heart. When Sarah was finally well enough to resume her normal activities, she insisted on helping Clara May finish the memory quilt. As they worked together, choosing the placement of each carefully preserved square, Clara May reflected on how much their small family had changed since her arrival in Cedar Ridge. The quilt was more than just a collection of outgrown dresses. It was a map of their journey together, a tangible record of love, freely given and gratefully received. "When I'm grown up and have my own house, will you make a quilt for my children?" Sarah asked as Clara May stitched the binding around the edges. "I'd be honored to," Clara May replied, her heart full with the promise of a future she could finally dare to imagine. Spring came late to the Montana mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation that went far beyond the melting of snow and the return of green to the hillsides. For Clara May, the change of seasons marked a turning point in her relationship with Jeremiah, a shift from the careful politeness of strangers sharing a house to something deeper and more genuine. A moment that would define their new understanding came on an evening in early April, when the last of the snow had finally melted from the cabin roof, and the sound of rushing water from the nearby creek filled the air with the music of renewal. Clara May was finishing the dishes after supper when Jeremiah approached her with something small cradled in his large, weathered hands. "I have something for you," he said quietly, his usual confidence replaced by an uncertainty that made him seem younger, despite his 35 years. Clara May dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him, curious about what could make this strong, capable man seem suddenly nervous. When he opened his hands, she gasped softly at what lay nestled in his palms. It was a wedding ring, not new, but polished to a warm golden glow that caught the lamplight and made it dance. The band was simple, engraved with a delicate pattern of intertwined vines that spoke of craftsmanship and care. Clara May recognized it immediately, though she had never seen it before. This was Mary's ring, the symbol of Jeremiah's first marriage, the token of a love that had been cut tragically short. "I know it's not new," Jeremiah said quickly, as if anticipating her objection. "And I know it belonged to Mary, but I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I think she would have wanted you to have it." Clara May's throat tightened with emotion. She had worn no wedding ring during their simple ceremony. Such luxuries were beyond their modest means, and she had accepted that fact without complaint. But now, looking at this precious circle of gold, she felt overwhelmed by the significance of what Jeremiah was offering. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. This was hers. This represented your life together. It represented a promise, Jeremiah corrected gently. A promise to love and honor and cherish. "I made that promise to you too, Clara May, in that church with half the town watching. But I've been wondering if you knew that I meant it." The question hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Clara May studied Jeremiah's face, seeing past the weathered exterior to the man beneath, a man who was offering her not just a piece of jewelry, but a place in his heart that she had begun to hope might someday be hers. "I hoped you might mean it," she admitted. "But I wasn't sure if you married me just for Sarah's sake, or because you needed help with the household, or I married you because your letters revealed a good heart," Jeremiah interrupted. "And I've come to care for you because of who you are, not what you do for us. Mary was my first love, and I'll always treasure what we had together. But you're not Mary, and I don't want you to be. You're Clara May, and you've brought something to this family that's entirely your own." With gentle care, he lifted Clara May's left hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. The gold felt warm against her skin, carrying with it the weight of promise and commitment that their hasty wedding ceremony had somehow lacked. "There," Jeremiah said with satisfaction. "Now it's official." "It was already official," Clara May replied, but she was smiling through tears that she made no effort to hide. "We signed the papers and took the vows." "Papers and vows are just words," Jeremiah said, his own voice rough with emotion. "This is something more. This is a promise that you belong here with us, for as long as we're blessed to have you." The sound of small bare feet on the wooden floor announced Sarah's arrival before she appeared in the doorway. Rubbing sleepy eyes and clearly drawn by the sound of adult conversation past her usual bedtime. "What's happening?" she asked with a yawn. "Why is everyone talking so quietly?" "Come here, little one," Jeremiah beckoned, and Sarah padded across the floor to lean against his knee. "I just gave Clara May something that belonged to your birth mama. I thought she should have it now." Sarah examined Clara May's hand with the serious attention she gave to all important matters. "It's pretty," she pronounced. "Mama would have liked Clara May to have it." She would have liked Clara May a lot. The simple certainty in Sarah's voice brought fresh tears to Clara May's eyes. To be accepted, not just by her living family, but somehow blessed by the memory of the woman who had come before her, felt like a gift beyond measure. "How do you know that, sweetheart?" Clara May asked gently. Sarah tilted her head with the wisdom that children sometimes display. "Because Mama loved Papa, and Papa loves you now, so Mama would want you to be happy. And because you take good care of me, just like Mama would have wanted." From the mouths of babes, Clara May thought, marveling at the child's ability to see past the complications that adults created and straight to the heart of what mattered. Love didn't diminish when it was shared. It multiplied. As spring progressed and the mountain community began to emerge from its winter isolation, Clara May found herself facing the outside world with new confidence. The ring on her finger was more than just a symbol of marriage. It was a declaration that she truly belonged to this family, that her place here was secure and valued. But it was during their first trip to town since Sarah's illness that Clara May truly understood how much their family dynamic had changed. They needed supplies for spring planting, and Jeremiah had business with the bank regarding his winter's trapping profits. Clara May and Sarah accompanied him, as had become their custom. The town was busier than it had been during the depths of winter, with farmers and ranchers emerging from their own periods of isolation to conduct business and catch up on community news. Clara May braced herself for the usual whispers and stares, but what she encountered instead surprised her. Mrs. Stone. Doc Henley greeted her warmly as they passed his office. "I heard young Sarah was under the weather this winter. I hope she's fully recovered." "Completely recovered, thank you," Clara May replied, touched by his genuine concern. "She's stronger than ever. I'm glad to hear it. You know, several folks in town mentioned how well you nursed her through that fever. It takes skill and dedication to break a fever that high without medical intervention." Clara May felt her cheeks warm with something other than embarrassment for once. This was the flush of deserved pride in a job well done. "I was fortunate to have learned from my grandmother. She was quite skilled with home remedies. Even Martha Caldwell seemed less openly hostile during their visit to the general store, though her manner remained coolly professional. I trust you found everything you needed for the winter?" she asked as she tallied their purchases. "We managed very well, thank you," Clara May replied diplomatically. "Sarah recovered beautifully from her illness." "Yes, I heard about that." Martha's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Children's fevers can be frightening. I'm glad she's well. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was progress." Clara May began to hope that perhaps time and familiarity might eventually wear down even the most stubborn prejudices. The real test came when they encountered a group of townspeople gathered outside the church, discussing plans for the annual spring social. Clara May's first instinct was to hurry past with her head down, avoiding any potential confrontation. But Sarah had no such reservations. "Are you planning the spring dance?" she asked Mrs. Patterson with bright curiosity. "Clara May is a wonderful dancer. She taught me how to waltz in our kitchen." Clara May's heart sank, certain that Sarah's innocent enthusiasm would only provide more ammunition for cruel comments. But Mrs. Patterson surprised her. "Is that so?" the boarding house proprietor asked, with what seemed like genuine interest. "We could certainly use help organizing the festivities. So many of our young people have moved away, and we're short on volunteers." "Oh, I'm sure Mrs. Stone is too busy with her household duties," Martha Caldwell interjected quickly, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Actually," Clara May heard herself saying, "I'd be happy to help if you think I could be useful. I organized several social events back in Philadelphia." The offer surprised even herself, but once the words were spoken, Clara May realized she meant them. She was tired of hiding from the community's judgment. If they were going to accept her or reject her, let it be based on her contributions rather than their assumptions. "That's very kind of you to offer," Mrs. Patterson said, and Clara May detected no insincerity in her tone. "Why don't you stop by the boarding house later this week? We're meeting to discuss the arrangements." As they walked home that afternoon, Clara May marveled at how much had changed since her arrival in Cedar Ridge. She was no longer the frightened mail-order bride hoping desperately for acceptance. She was Jeremiah Stone's wife, Sarah Stone's mother, and a woman beginning to find her place in a community that was slowly learning to see her as a person rather than a curiosity. The ring on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight as she helped Sarah collect wildflowers along the roadside, and Clara May smiled at its warm sparkle. It was a symbol of belonging, of love earned and freely given, of a future that looked brighter than any she had dared to imagine during those lonely years in Philadelphia. That evening, as she and Jeremiah worked together in comfortable silence, he sharpening tools for spring planting while she mended a torn dress for Sarah, Clara May reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Montana hoping for acceptance and had found instead something much more precious, a family that valued her for who she was, and the confidence to value herself in return. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May, carried by a dusty rider who had traveled the mountain roads from the nearest telegraph office 20 miles away. Clara May was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of approaching hooves, and she felt an immediate flutter of anxiety in her chest. In her experience, unexpected messages rarely brought good news. Jeremiah emerged from the barn, where he had been repairing a broken harness, his expression alert and concerned. Telegrams were rare enough in their remote corner of Montana that their arrival always signaled something significant, usually death, disaster, or urgent business that couldn't wait for regular mail. "Telegram for Mrs. Clara May Stone," the rider announced, consulting the yellow paper in his hand. "From Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Clara May's hands trembled as she accepted the telegram, her mind racing through possibilities. She had no family left in Philadelphia, no friends who would spend money on urgent communication. The only people who knew her married name and location were the few business contacts who had handled the sale of her meager possessions before she left for Montana. "Thank you," she managed to say to the rider, pressing a coin into his hand for his trouble. Was there any indication of how urgent this might be? "No, ma'am. Just that it was to be delivered as soon as possible." The rider tipped his hat respectfully. "I hope it's good news." As the rider disappeared down the mountain road, Clara May stared at the telegram in her hands, afraid to open it. Jeremiah approached quietly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together," he said simply. "Good news or bad, you're not alone anymore," drawing strength from his steady presence. Clara May carefully opened the telegram and read the contents aloud. "Clara May Stone, stop, regret to inform you of death of great-uncle Thaddeus Hartwell. Stop, as sole surviving heir you inherit estate value. Approximately $15,000. Stop. Please contact Wiggins and Sons. Attorneys, Philadelphia, immediately stop. Condolences. Stop." The paper fluttered from Clara May's nerveless fingers as the implications of the message sank in. $15,000 was a fortune by any standard, but especially for people who had been living on the modest income from Jeremiah's trapping and the small savings Clara May had brought from her seamstress wages. $15,000, Jeremiah said slowly, bending to retrieve the telegram from the ground. "Clara May, do you realize what this means?" But Clara May was thinking beyond the money itself to what it would mean for their carefully constructed life. $15,000 would change everything: their status in the community, their daily concerns, their future possibilities. More troubling was what it might mean for how others saw her and how they had treated her up until now. "I don't even remember a great-uncle Thaddeus," she said wonderingly. "He must have been my grandmother's brother, but she never spoke of him. I thought all my relatives were dead." Sarah came running from the house, drawn by the unusual activity. "What's wrong?" she asked, her young face creased with concern. "Why does everyone look so serious?" "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," Clara May said, kneeling down to the child's level. "We just received some surprising news. It seems I had a great-uncle I never knew about, and he left me some money when he died." "How much money?" Sarah asked with the frank curiosity of childhood. "A lot of money," Jeremiah replied carefully. "More money than most people in Cedar Ridge have ever seen." The full implications began to sink in as they discussed the news over lunch. Clara May would need to travel back to Philadelphia to settle the estate, a journey that would take weeks and require them to be separated for the first time since their marriage. There would be legal documents to sign, decisions to make about what to do with inherited property, and countless details that could only be handled in person. But it was the thought of how this news would affect their standing in Cedar Ridge that troubled Clara May most. For months, she had been working to earn acceptance based on her character and contributions to the community. Now suddenly she was wealthy, and she knew from painful experience how quickly people's attitudes could change when money entered the equation. "We need to think carefully about how we handle this," she said, as they discussed their options. "People in town are just beginning to accept me for who I am. When they find out about this inheritance, everything will change." "Maybe it will change for the better," Jeremiah suggested, though his tone indicated he understood her concerns. Maybe this will finally make them see your worth. But that's exactly the problem, Clara May replied, with growing frustration. I don't want them to value me because I have money. I want them to value me because of who I am as a person. If they suddenly start treating me with respect because of my inheritance, how will I know if any of it is genuine? The wisdom of her concerns became apparent the very next day, when word of the telegram somehow reached Cedar Ridge ahead of them. Clara May suspected that the telegraph rider had mentioned the delivery during his return journey, and news of that magnitude traveled quickly through a small community. Their first indication of how dramatically things had changed came when they encountered Martha Caldwell on the main street. Instead of her usual cool politeness, Martha approached them with a warmth that seemed almost aggressive in its intensity. "Mrs. Stone," she gushed, "how lovely to see you today. I was just telling my husband what a valuable addition you've been to our little community. Such refinement and culture, exactly what Cedar Ridge needs to elevate its standing in the territory." Clara May felt her stomach turn at the obvious falseness of Martha's sudden enthusiasm. This was the same woman who had barely concealed her disdain just weeks earlier, who had made cutting remarks about Clara May's appearance and suitability as a wife. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell," Clara May replied carefully. "You're very kind." "Kind? Nonsense, I'm simply stating facts. I was wondering if you might have time to discuss some improvements we've been considering for the general store. With your experience in Philadelphia, you'd surely have valuable insights about what modern customers expect." The transparent attempt to curry favor was both insulting and depressing. Clara May made polite excuses and escaped as quickly as possible, but similar encounters followed throughout their visit to town. People who had previously ignored her now smiled and nodded respectfully. Those who had been openly hostile now seemed eager to engage her in conversation about community affairs. Most disturbing of all was the reaction of some of the younger men in town, unmarried cowboys and clerks who suddenly seemed to find Clara May fascinating in ways that had nothing to do with her personality or character. Their attention made her deeply uncomfortable, and she could see the muscle working in Jeremiah's jaw as he observed their behavior. "It's disgusting," he said bluntly as they drove home. "Like vultures circling something they think might benefit them." "I knew this would happen," Clara May said sadly. "I've seen it before back in Philadelphia. People who wouldn't give me the time of day suddenly became interested when they thought there might be some advantage in knowing me. But it was Sarah's innocent observation that cut deepest." "Why is everyone being so nice to you all of a sudden, Mama? Did you do something special?" Clara May struggled to answer without burdening the child with adult cynicism. "Sometimes people change how they act toward others for reasons that don't have much to do with the person themselves," she said carefully. "That doesn't make sense." Sarah said with the logical directness of childhood, "If they like you now, why didn't they like you before? You're still the same person." "Yes," Clara May said quietly. "I am still the same person." That evening, as Clara May sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, she found herself questioning everything she had begun to believe about her place in the community. Had any of the small signs of acceptance she had observed been genuine? Were people like Doc Henley and Mrs. Patterson truly warming to her as a person, or had word of her changed financial circumstances somehow reached them ahead of the official announcement? Jeremiah joined her on the porch, settling into the chair beside her with a heavy sigh. "You're thinking too hard," he observed. "I can practically hear the wheels turning in your head." "I don't know what's real anymore," Clara May admitted. "I was starting to believe that I might actually belong here, that people were beginning to see past their first impressions. But if their sudden friendliness is all about money, then they're fools who don't deserve your concern," Jeremiah interrupted firmly. "But not everyone is like Martha Caldwell, Clara May. Some people have been genuine in their acceptance of you, and this inheritance won't change that." "How can I tell the difference?" "The same way you always have, by paying attention to their actions rather than their words." Doc Henley was kind to you from the beginning, when you had nothing to offer him but conversation. Mrs. Patterson offered you a chance to help with the spring social before she knew about the money. Those gestures were real. Clara May wanted to believe him, but the day's experiences had shaken her confidence in her ability to judge people's motives. She had spent too many years being dismissed and mocked to easily trust sudden reversals of attitude. "What are we going to do about the inheritance?" she asked, changing the subject to more practical matters. "We're going to handle it the way we handle everything else, together," Jeremiah replied. "You'll need to go to Philadelphia to settle the legal matters, and Sarah and I will come with you. We're a family now, and families stick together through the difficult times as well as the good ones." The simple declaration brought tears to Clara May's eyes. Whatever challenges the inheritance might bring, whatever tests it might pose to their relationships within the community, she would not face them alone. She had a husband who valued her for herself and a daughter who loved her unconditionally, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. The notice appeared on the bulletin board outside the general store 3 days after. Clara May returned from Philadelphia, where she had spent 2 weeks settling her great-uncle's estate. The official-looking paper, written in Martha Caldwell's careful script, announced a town meeting to be held the following Saturday evening at the church. The stated purpose was to discuss community development opportunities and the role of new prosperity in advancing our shared interests. Clara May stared at the notice with growing dread, understanding immediately what it really meant. The entire town wanted to discuss her inheritance and what it might mean for them. She had hoped that her absence might allow the initial excitement to die down, but clearly the opposite had occurred. In her absence, speculation and scheming had only intensified. "They're calling a meeting about me," she said to Jeremiah as they loaded supplies into their wagon. "About my money, anyway." "Let them meet," Jeremiah replied grimly. "What you do with your inheritance is nobody's business but your own." But Clara May knew it wasn't that simple. In a small community like Cedar Ridge, everyone's affairs were interconnected. Her sudden wealth affected the social and economic balance of the entire town, and pretending otherwise would be naive. The trip to Philadelphia had been both enlightening and exhausting. The legal proceedings had been straightforward enough. Her great-uncle Thaddeus had indeed been her grandmother's brother, a reclusive businessman who had invested wisely in railroad stocks and left no other heirs. But more challenging had been facing the city where she had spent so many unhappy years. Now, as a woman of substance rather than a struggling seamstress, the lawyers had been respectful, even deferential, in ways that their predecessors never had been when she was poor. Shop clerks, who had previously treated her with barely concealed disdain, now smiled and fawned over her. It was Philadelphia's version of what she was experiencing in Cedar Ridge, and it left her feeling hollow and disconnected from the person she had become in Montana. Most disturbing had been an encounter with Mrs. Pemberton, her former employer at the dress shop. The woman who had criticized Clara May's every move and made her working life miserable had suddenly appeared at her hotel, all smiles and false warmth. "My dear Clara May," she had gushed, "I always knew you were destined for great things. I was just telling my customers about my former employee who married so well out west. Perhaps you might consider investing in a small dress shop. I know of several excellent opportunities." Clara May had politely declined, but the encounter had reinforced her determination to use her inheritance wisely and authentically. She had seen too clearly how money could corrupt relationships and reveal the worst in people's character. Now, back in Montana, with legal documents securing her $15,000 safely in a Denver bank, Clara May faced the challenge of navigating her changed circumstances within her adopted community. The week leading up to the town meeting was filled with increasingly obvious attempts by various townspeople to curry her favor. The banker, Mr. Harrison, suddenly discovered urgent reasons to visit the stone cabin. bringing elaborate proposals for investment opportunities that would, coincidentally, greatly benefit his own institution. The mayor, a pompous man named Fitzgerald, whom Clara May had previously met only in passing, appeared with suggestions for civic improvements that would require Martha Caldwell's voice carried through the packed church with the confidence of someone who had orchestrated this evening's events down to the smallest detail. As I was saying, she continued, we've all witnessed the remarkable transformation that prosperity can bring to our little community. Mrs. Stone's recent good fortune presents us with unprecedented opportunities for growth and improvement. Clara May felt the weight of every gaze in the church focused upon her, and she instinctively reached into her coat pocket where Sarah's courage stone rested against her palm. The child had pressed it into her hand just before they entered the church, whispering, "For bravery, Mama, you're the bravest person I know." Now, Martha continued, warming to her subject, I'm sure we all have ideas about how this windfall might benefit our community. After all, Mrs. Stone has found a home here among us, and surely she wants to see Cedar Ridge prosper and grow. The first hand to shoot up belonged to Mayor Fitzgerald, a man whose political ambitions had always exceeded his actual authority in the small mountain town. Thank you, Martha. I think we can all agree that our main street desperately needs improvement. Wooden sidewalks, proper drainage, maybe even gas lighting like they have in the bigger cities. With the right investment, Cedar Ridge could become the jewel of this territory. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd, and Clara May noticed how quickly the conversation had moved from theoretical possibilities to specific expectations. These people had clearly spent considerable time planning how to spend her money. An excellent point, Martha agreed enthusiastically. And I'm sure Mrs. Stone appreciates the warm welcome she's received from our community. It would be natural for her to want to give back to the people who embraced her so readily. The historical revision was breathtaking in its audacity. Clara May remembered all too clearly the cold stares, whispered insults, and open mockery she had endured. The idea that she had been warmly welcomed was so contrary to reality that she felt momentarily dizzy with the sheer brazenness of it. Banker Harrison stood up next, his proposal clearly rehearsed. I'd like to suggest that we consider the establishment of a proper lending institution. With adequate capitalization, we could offer reasonable interest rates to local farmers and businessmen, spurring economic development throughout the region. Now you're talking sense, called out one of the ranchers from the back of the church. I've been wanting to expand my operation for years, but the nearest bank charges rates that would bankrupt a man. Clara May watched the proceedings with growing dismay as speaker after speaker rose to outline their vision for how her inheritance should be deployed. A new schoolhouse, a railroad spur, improvements to the church, a proper hotel to attract travelers. The list seemed endless, and each proposal was presented as if her agreement was merely a formality. It was when Jake Morrison, one of the younger cowboys who had recently begun paying her unwanted attention, stood up that Clara May felt her composure begin to crack. I think we're all forgetting the most important thing here, Jake said with a confidence that belied his 23 years. Mrs. Stone is a fine woman who deserves a fine life. Maybe instead of thinking about businesses and buildings, we should be thinking about whether she's getting the appreciation she deserves from her current arrangements. The implication hung heavy in the air, and Clara May felt Jeremiah tense beside her. Jake's meaning was clear. He was suggesting that a woman of means might want to reconsider her marriage to a simple mountain man, might prefer the company of someone who could match her new social status. I think, Jake continued, emboldened by the attention, that a lady of Mrs. Stone's obvious refinement and newfound prosperity might find herself reconsidering some of the decisions she made when her circumstances were different. The church fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows. Clara May could feel the collective held breath of the congregation, waiting to see how she would respond to this brazen challenge to her marriage and her loyalty to Jeremiah. Before Clara May could gather her thoughts to respond, Sarah Stone rose from her seat with the fearless determination that had marked every important moment of her young life. At 7 years old, she barely reached the height of the pew back in front of her, but her clear voice carried through the church with unmistakable authority. "Excuse me," Sarah said, her tone polite but firm. "I think there's something everyone needs to understand." Martha Caldwell looked flustered by the interruption. "Sarah, dear, this is a meeting for adults." "Perhaps you should—" "No," Sarah interrupted with the kind of quiet strength that Clara May recognized as pure Jeremiah Stone. "I need to say this now, because everyone is being mean to my mama again, and I won't let that happen." The church fell completely silent. Even the rain seemed to pause as a 7-year-old girl prepared to address a room full of adults who had forgotten the lessons that children learn instinctively. "My mama didn't come here because she wanted your money or your buildings or your stupid ideas," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She came here because my papa needed a wife and I needed a mama. And you know what? We got lucky because she's the best mama in the whole world." Clara May felt tears beginning to blur her vision, but she didn't dare move or speak. This was Sarah's moment, and the child was proving that courage could come in very small packages. "When I was really sick last winter, my mama stayed with me for 3 days straight. She didn't sleep, she didn't eat, hardly anything. She just took care of me, because that's what mamas do. And you know what else? She never asked for anything back. She didn't want my papa's money or his house or his anything. She just wanted to be part of our family." Sarah turned to look directly at Jake Morrison, and her 7-year-old gaze was steadier than that of many adults Clara May had known. "And Mr. Morrison, my papa is worth 100 of you, even if my mama had all the money in the world. Papa loves her because she's kind and smart and makes the best biscuits in Montana. That's better than money." The cowboy's face reddened, but he had enough sense not to argue with a child who was making him look foolish in front of the entire community. Sarah wasn't finished. She turned back to address the whole congregation, and Clara May marveled at her stepdaughter's poise in the face of what must have been terrifying adult attention. "All of you people are being mean to my mama again, just like you were when she first came here. Back then, you didn't like her because you thought she wasn't good enough. Now you're pretending to like her because she has money. But you know what? She's exactly the same person she always was. Kind and good and beautiful on the inside, which is the only kind of beautiful that really matters." Martha Caldwell attempted to regain control of the meeting. "Sarah, dear, we all appreciate—" "No, you don't," Sarah said with devastating honesty. "You don't appreciate her at all. You just want her money." "But I know something you don't know." She paused, and Clara May could see the theatrical timing that marked all great speakers, even 7-year-old ones. "My mama doesn't need your money to be happy," Sarah announced. "And she doesn't need you to like her to know she's special. She's got me and Papa, and we love her just exactly the way she is. We loved her when she didn't have any money, and we'll love her no matter what. That's what real families do." The silence that followed Sarah's speech was different from the expectant hush that had preceded it. This was the silence of people who had been confronted with an uncomfortable truth and didn't quite know how to respond. In the profound silence that followed Sarah's brave words, Clara May rose slowly to her feet. The courage stone felt warm in her palm, and she drew strength from the knowledge that this precious child saw her clearly, not as a source of money or an object of pity, but as a person worthy of love and respect. "Thank you, Sarah," Clara May said softly, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "You've said something very important that I think everyone needs to hear." She turned to face the congregation, and for the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Clara May felt no shame or anxiety about being the center of attention. The woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 8 months ago, terrified and desperate for acceptance, was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned her own worth through the patient love of a good man and the fierce loyalty of a brave child. "I want to tell you all a story," Clara May began, her voice steady and clear. "It's about a woman who came to your town because she had nowhere else to go. She was lonely and afraid, and she hoped that maybe, in a place where people valued hard work and good character, she might finally find acceptance. She gestured toward the wooden cross that hung at the front of the church, the same cross she had touched during her wedding ceremony when the cruelty of the congregation had threatened to overwhelm her. But when that woman arrived, she found something different than she had hoped for. She found people who judged her by her appearance, who whispered cruel things behind her back, who treated her like she was something distasteful they had to tolerate. She found a community that measured her worth by standards that had nothing to do with her character or her heart. Martha Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and Clara May noticed several other people looking down at their hands rather than meeting her gaze. That woman could have become bitter, Clara May continued. She could have given up on trying to build a life here, but she had something more powerful than your disapproval. She had the love of a good man who saw her true value, and the trust of a little girl who needed a mother. Clara May's voice grew warmer as she spoke of Jeremiah and Sarah, and she saw understanding begin to dawn on some faces in the congregation. So that woman stayed, and she worked to prove herself worthy of the family that had accepted her. She cooked and cleaned and sewed. She nursed a sick child through a dangerous fever. She contributed to church socials and helped neighbors in need, not because she was trying to buy acceptance, but because that's who she was, someone who believed in the value of community and service. The silence in the church was now absolute, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the windows, and slowly, some of you began to see past your first impressions, Clara May said, her tone softening as she looked toward Doc Henley and Mrs. Patterson and the few others who had shown her genuine kindness. Some of you discovered that the woman you had dismissed might actually have something to offer. Then her voice grew firm again, carrying the authority of someone who had found her strength through suffering. But now, because of circumstances beyond my control, I have money, and suddenly all of you want to be my friend. Suddenly I'm refined and cultured, and exactly what this community needs. The same people who mocked me 8 months ago now speak of how warmly I was welcomed. Clara May paused, letting the uncomfortable truth settle over the congregation. Do you want to know what I learned in Philadelphia while I was settling my inheritance? She asked. I learned that wealth changes how people see you, but it doesn't change who you are inside. I met people who had scorned me when I was poor and now wanted to profit from my good fortune. I saw clearly how money could corrupt relationships and reveal the worst in people's characters. She reached into her coat and pulled out Sarah's courage stone, holding it up so everyone could see the simple river rock that had given her strength. This is my daughter's courage stone, Clara May said. She gave it to me tonight because she knew I would need to be brave. A 7-year-old child understood something that most of you seem to have forgotten, that real courage isn't about having money or power. It's about standing up for what's right. Even when it's difficult, Clara May's voice grew stronger, filled with the conviction of someone who had finally found her voice. You want to know what I'm going to do with my inheritance? I'm going to use it to help people who need it, not because they flatter me or scheme for my attention, but because it's the right thing to do. I'll help the widow Thompson fix her roof because she's too proud to ask and too poor to afford it. I'll make sure old Pete Miller has enough firewood for the winter because he helped my husband when we needed it and asked for nothing in return. The church stirred with murmurs as people began to understand that Clara May's vision of community service looked very different from their elaborate schemes. I'll help fund a real school with books and proper supplies because every child deserves the chance to learn. But I won't build monuments to my own prosperity, and I won't reward people for suddenly discovering my worth now that I have money in the bank. Clara May's gaze swept across the congregation, and she saw shame beginning to replace greed on many faces. Most importantly, she continued, I'm going to remember who stood by me when I had nothing to offer but myself. My husband, who valued my character over my appearance from the very beginning. My daughter, who loved me before she even knew my name. and the few people in this community who treated me with kindness when kindness was all I had to give in return. She turned to look directly at Martha Caldwell, and her voice carried a note of sadness rather than anger. "Mrs. Caldwell, you said I should be grateful for the warm welcome I received from this community. But the truth is, I'm grateful for the cold welcome I received because it taught me to recognize the difference between real friendship and false flattery. It helped me understand the value of the genuine acceptance I found in my family." Martha's face was now bright red, but she seemed incapable of responding to Clara May's calm recitation of facts. "As for Mr. Morrison's suggestion that I might want to reconsider my marriage," Clara May said, turning to face the young cowboy with a mixture of pity and contempt, "I can only say that a man who thinks a woman's loyalty can be bought with flattery understands neither women nor loyalty." Jake Morrison slouched lower in his seat, apparently realizing that his romantic ambitions had just been publicly demolished by a woman who had more dignity in her little finger than he possessed in his entire body. Clara May moved to stand beside Jeremiah and Sarah, placing her hands on their shoulders in a gesture that spoke louder than any words about where her true loyalties lay. "This is my family," she said simply. "These are the people who saw my worth when I had nothing material to offer, who loved me when I was afraid and alone, who stood by me when others showed cruelty. No amount of money could buy what they gave me freely: acceptance, respect, and love." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of collective shame. Clara May had held up a mirror to the community, and most people didn't like what they saw reflected there, but it was Sarah who provided the final, devastating insight that would echo through Cedar Ridge for years to come. Standing up beside her stepmother, the little girl looked out at the assembled adults with the clear-eyed wisdom of childhood. "She's pretty." "Daddy," Sarah said, repeating the words that had become her rallying cry. "She's pretty because she's good and kind and she loves us. And if you can't see that, then you're not looking hard enough." With those simple words, Sarah Stone crystallized the entire conflict into a truth so pure and undeniable that even the most hardened hearts in that church could not escape its impact. Beauty, worth, and love had nothing to do with money or social status or physical appearance. They had everything to do with character, kindness, and the courage to see beyond surface judgments to the person underneath. 6 months after the town meeting that had changed everything in Cedar Ridge, Clara May Stone stood in the doorway of the new schoolhouse, watching her daughter Sarah help younger children with their letters. The building was simple but sturdy, constructed with funds from Clara May's inheritance and the labor of men who had offered their services freely, not from greed, but from genuine desire to see their community's children educated properly. The family photograph on Clara May's desk caught the morning sunlight streaming through the schoolhouse windows. In it, 3 people stood together on the porch of their mountain cabin, Jeremiah tall and proud in his Sunday best, Sarah grinning with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved, and Clara May herself, no longer the frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, but someone who had found her place in the world. The photograph had been taken by a traveling photographer who had stopped in Cedar Ridge the previous month, and it represented something Clara May had never thought she would possess, a tangible record of her belonging. A proof that she was part of something larger and more permanent than her own solitary existence. "Mrs. Stone," called little Tommy Patterson from the back of the classroom.
"Sarah says you used to live in a big city."
"Is that true?" "It is true, Tommy," Clara May replied, moving to help him with the difficult word he was trying to spell. "I lived in Philadelphia before I came to Montana. Do you ever want to go back?" asked Mary Catherine Miller, looking up from her slate with curious eyes. Clara May considered the question seriously, as she did all inquiries from her students. These children deserved honest answers, not the simplified responses adults often gave to avoid difficult conversations. "Sometimes I think about Philadelphia," she said carefully. "It was where I learned many things that helped me be a better teacher and mother. But Cedar Ridge is my home now, because this is where my family is. And home is wherever the people you love need you to be. The answer seemed to satisfy the children, who returned to their lessons with the easy acceptance that marked their generation. They had known Clara May only as their teacher and Sarah's mother, someone who belonged in their community as naturally as the mountains that surrounded their valley. It was recess when Doc Henley appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, his familiar black bag in hand, but his manner suggesting this was a social rather than medical call. Clara May had grown genuinely fond of the older man, who had been one of the few people to treat her with consistent kindness from her earliest days in Montana. "How are your students progressing?" he asked, settling into one of the adult-sized chairs Clara May had requested for parent visits. "Remarkably well," she replied with pride. "Sarah's reading at a level far beyond her years, and even the youngest ones are beginning to grasp basic arithmetic. Having proper books and supplies makes such a difference." Doc Henley nodded approvingly. "The whole town's talking about the improvement in the children's education. You've given them something precious, the tools to make better lives for themselves. Through the windows, they could see the children at play in the schoolyard, their laughter mixing with the sound of hammers from across the street, where construction continued on other improvements Clara May had quietly funded. A new roof for the church, better heating for the boarding house, repairs to the bridge that connected Cedar Ridge to the main road, projects chosen not for their visibility, but for their genuine benefit to people's daily lives. "Have you heard from Martha Caldwell lately?" Doc Henley asked with the careful neutrality he used when discussing delicate subjects. Clara May smiled wryly. Martha had been among the most vocal critics of Clara May's approach to philanthropy, arguing loudly that such a fortunate woman should think bigger, should fund projects that would put Cedar Ridge on the territorial map, rather than focusing on mundane improvements to people's everyday lives. "She stopped by last week to suggest that I reconsider funding for a grand hotel," Clara May replied. "She seems to believe that attracting wealthy travelers should be our primary goal." "And your response?" "I told her that I'm more interested in making life better for the people who already live here than in impressing strangers who might pass through, that the philosophical divide between Clara May's quiet practical charity and some townspeople's dreams of grandeur had become a defining characteristic of Cedar Ridge's social landscape. Some residents had come to respect her choices, understanding that her approach created lasting improvements in their daily lives, rather than grand gestures that might benefit only a few. Others, like Martha Caldwell, continued to view her inheritance as a missed opportunity for the kind of development that would bring prestige to their small community. But their voices had grown quieter over the months, especially as the practical benefits of Clara May's choices became increasingly obvious. "Speaking of practical improvements," Doc Henley said, "I wanted to thank you again for the medical supplies you provided. Having proper instruments and medicines has made a real difference in the care I can provide." Clara May waved away his gratitude with characteristic modesty. "A healthy community benefits everyone, Doc. Besides, you've never charged the families who couldn't afford to pay. It seemed only fair that you should have the tools you need to do your work properly." After Doc Henley left to continue his rounds, Clara May found herself reflecting on the unexpected turns her life had taken. The inheritance that had initially threatened to destroy the acceptance she had worked so hard to earn had instead become a tool for building the kind of community she believed in, one that valued all its members and worked to lift everyone up, rather than just the fortunate few. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Jake Morrison, the young cowboy who had made such a fool of himself at the town meeting by suggesting Clara May might want to abandon her family for someone more suitable to her new status. He appeared in the schoolhouse doorway, hat in hand, his usual swagger replaced by obvious embarrassment. "Mrs. Stone," he began awkwardly, "I was wondering if I might have a word." Clara May gestured to the chair Doc Henley had vacated, curious about what could have brought the young man to seek her out. Jake had avoided her completely since the night of the town meeting, and she had assumed their paths would never cross in any meaningful way again. "I came to apologize," he said without preamble, his face reddening as he spoke, "for what I said at the meeting and for thinking I had any right to suggest you should leave your husband for someone like me." Clara May studied his face, looking for signs of the insincerity that had marked so many interactions since her inheritance became known. What she saw instead was genuine shame and what appeared to be hard-won wisdom. "What changed your mind, Mr. Morrison?" she asked quietly. Jake's laugh was rueful and self-deprecating. "My sister came to visit from Colorado. She heard about what happened at the meeting, and she set me straight in terms that would make a sailor blush. Made me realize I was acting like the kind of man I always said I despised, someone who thought women were prizes to be won based on their circumstances, rather than people to be respected for who they are." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily to him. "I also watched how you've handled your good fortune," he continued. "Instead of using it to lord over people or buy yourself a fancy life, you've used it to make things better for everyone. That takes a kind of character I'm not sure I possess. And it made me realize how wrong I was about everything." Clara May felt a genuine warmth toward the young man for the first time since she had known him. This was the kind of apology that meant something, not just regret for getting caught in bad behavior, but real understanding of why the behavior had been wrong in the first place. "Apology accepted, Mr. Morrison," she said simply. "We all make mistakes when we let our assumptions guide us, instead of taking the time to really see people for who they are." As Jake left, obviously relieved to have cleared his conscience, Clara May reflected on how much the entire community had changed since that contentious night at the church. Some people, like Jake, had learned to see past their prejudices and assumptions. Others had simply learned to treat her with the respect that money commanded, even if their underlying attitudes hadn't shifted. But perhaps most importantly, Clara May herself had changed. The woman who had once desperately craved acceptance from anyone willing to give it had learned to value her own worth independently of other people's opinions. She had found her voice, her strength, and her place in a world that no longer seemed designed to exclude her. The school day ended with Sarah helping Clara May clean the blackboards and organize the next day's lessons. As they worked together in comfortable silence, Clara May marveled at how completely this child had become the center of her world. Not because she felt obligated to love Jeremiah's daughter, but because Sarah had earned that love through her courage, wisdom, and the kind of fierce loyalty that transcended all boundaries of blood and law. "Mama," Sarah said as they prepared to leave the schoolhouse, "do you ever think about how different things would be if you hadn't come to Cedar Ridge?" The question was characteristically thoughtful, and Clara May considered it seriously as they walked toward home through the late afternoon mountain air. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "I probably would have stayed in Philadelphia, working in that dress shop, growing old and lonely, without ever knowing what it felt like to be part of a real family. And Papa and I would never have had you," Sarah added with the practical consideration she brought to all important matters. "We would have missed out on the best mama in the world." As they crested the hill that revealed their cabin nestled among the pines, Clara May saw Jeremiah waiting on the porch, his day's work finished and his patient love as constant as the mountains themselves. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth and the kind of evening conversations that had become the foundation of their shared life. The wooden doll that Sarah had given her on their wedding day still sat on the mantelpiece, but it was now joined by other symbols of their journey together. The memory quilt folded carefully in the cedar chest, Mary's wedding ring that had become Clara May's own symbol of belonging, and dozens of small mementos that marked the passage of days lived in contentment rather than merely survived. As they approached their home, Clara May realized that she had found something more precious than the inheritance that had threatened to complicate her life. She had found a place where she was valued not for what she could provide, but for who she was. She had learned that true beauty lay not in meeting other people's expectations, but in the courage to be authentically herself. And she had discovered that the most lasting transformations happen not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the patient accumulation of small acts of love, kindness, and acceptance that gradually changed hearts and minds in ways that no amount of money ever could. "She's pretty, Daddy," Sarah had said that night at the town meeting, and those words had become more than just a child's defense of her stepmother. They had become a declaration that worth and beauty and love could not be measured by conventional standards, and that sometimes the most important truths came from the mouths of babes who saw the world with clearer eyes than the adults around them. As the three of them settled into their evening routine, Clara May reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from the loneliness of Philadelphia to the fullness of this Montana mountain home. She had learned that belonging was not something that could be granted by others, but something that had to be claimed through courage, maintained through character, and shared through love. The woman who had once believed herself unworthy of acceptance had become someone who no longer needed that acceptance to know her own value. And in finding her strength, she had created a family and touched a community in ways that would ripple forward through generations yet to come.